Greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Le Chevalier and I serve as Associate Director here. Lumen Christi was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago, and our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition a living dialogue partner at the University of Chicago, in the broader academy, and within our wider society through courses, lectures, summer seminars for graduate and undergraduate students, and virtual events like these. Now, we have an embarrassing riches of events in the coming 2 weeks. This Thursday, with a host of other partners, we are putting on an event entitled Among the Fragments, Race and the Fragile Hope of Wholeness in America with Willie James Jennings from Yale University. Our series on Hispanic theology continues next Tuesday with Miguel Romero from Salve Regina University presenting Was Something Lost? Thomas Aquinas' Intellectual Disability in the 16th Century Spanish Colonial Debates, looking at some of the Latino sources for considering a Latino theology of disability. Since 2008, we've worked to bring economics in dialogue with Catholic social thought, and next week, Thursday, on April 29th, we are hosting an event on automation and the future of work, insights from economics and Catholic social thought. And finally, next week, Saturday, we are hosting Jen Frey, Russell Hittinger, and Father Michael Sherwin for an event entitled United by Their Loves, Deciphering Augustine's Understanding of a People. So for anyone who's really interested in ethics or in Catholic social thought, really these are the 2 weeks at Lumen Christi that you do not want to miss these coming months. Today's event is part of our Hispanic Theology series, a part of our ongoing commitment to present the depths and breadths of the Catholic intellectual tradition in all its variety. The whole series will be recorded and posted to YouTube, and I encourage you to share it with colleagues and friends who are unable to participate today. This series is made possible by a generous grant from the Our Sunday Visitor Institute, and it is co-sponsored by Actus, the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the U.S., La Comunidad of Hispanic Scholars of Religion, Corazon Puro, the Collegium Institute, Dominican University Ministry Program, Ecclesia in America Network, the Hank Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Oscar Romero Scholars Program at Catholic Theological Union, Iscali, Commonweal Magazine, and America Media. I'm grateful to these many institutions that have helped ensure the success of today's event. Now, you too can support our programs in 3 different ways. First, you can join our mailing list and share word about these events with others. Word of mouth continues to remain the most effective means of inviting others into dialogue with the Catholic intellectual tradition. At the end of today's event, you'll be invited to participate in a survey that will help us to gauge what we are doing right and wrong in our programming. Filling it out, you'll enter a raffle to win a gift card to our favorite independent bookstore, the Seminary Co-op. And finally, you can support us financially by donating today to help us to continue to put on events like these for free to viewers like you. You can donate today at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. Now, during today's event, at the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. You can, however, post a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will also have an opportunity to give voice to our audience members, and at that time, when we get to our Q&A, you can simply raise your hand using the same raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. As a disclaimer, this program today is being recorded. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's moderator, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Peter Casarella is Professor of Theology at Duke Divinity School. Peter has served as President of the American Cusanus Society, of Actus, and the Academy of Catholic Theologians. He's also a longtime friend and collaborator with the Institute and a key partner in organizing this series. Peter, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Buenas noches y buenas tardes. Good evening to everybody. Buenas noches for those who are with me on the East Coast. Buenas tardes for those who are farther west. Thank you, Michael, for those lovely words. being fratelli, or all the more so being sorelli for Pope Francis, is something very concrete. And I would be very remiss if I didn't make at least a prefatory gesture tonight about how, with the news from Minneapolis, maybe, just maybe, there's just a faint glimmer of hope in the long struggle in this country to achieve racial justice. Together with that, I also wanted to put this presentation tonight in the context of Lumen Christi, and maybe just recall one theme that you find in David Tracy's 1987 book, Plurality and Ambiguity. He takes as an example for all challenges regarding the struggle to achieve a proper interpretation in the midst of plurality and ambiguity, the French Revolution itself, and draws many lines of convergence between the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality that came from that event to the present, including Medellin, 1968, in Latin America. But he doesn't mention the forgotten ideal of the French Revolution, which is the topic for tonight's presentation, fraternité, or better yet, fraternidad. So we have tonight the opportunity to consider Latino insights into fraternity. And we have an excellent speaker to guide us into this path. So let me, without further ado, just say a brief word of introduction regarding my dear friend and longtime colleague, David Lantigua. David is a part Paraguayan, part Cuban, and 100% Floridian, but right now teaches moral theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he's also co-director for the Catholic Social Tradition Minor. David has many publications, recent publications, and I'll just highlight some of those. In 2020, he published Infidels and Empires in a New World Order, Early Modern Spanish Contributions to International Legal Thought with Cambridge Press. And in the same year, Bartolomé Las Casas and the Defense of Amerindian Rights, a brief history with documents, co-edited with Lawrence Clayton with University of Alabama Press. He's now working on the third edition of a co-edited volume with Daryl Fashion and Del Dechant, entitled Comparative Religious Ethics, a Narrative Approach to Global Ethics. David was an active participant, something was just mentioned regarding the network Ecclesia in America. When we met in Rio de Janeiro, he was an active participant and presented on colonialisms and the rights of indigenous. And that will come out in the forthcoming book that's being edited by Maria Clara Bingham and myself. And finally, he was the recent recipient of a Louisville Institute sabbatical grant for his future project, The Earth is the Lord's, Mammon and Popular Social Catholicism in the Global Age of Pope Francis. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David. And I want to thank you very much, David, for being with us tonight and for agreeing to give this presentation.
Great, thank you, Peter, so much for that generous introduction. Thank you to the Lumen Christi Institute for inviting me to be a part of this, this great Hispanic theology series. To all the sponsors that were mentioned by Michael, thanks to you, and thanks to all of you viewers. Buenas noches, buenas tardes. Thank you for joining this event and viewing it. And for all those, I guess, who will be viewing it in the future, perhaps, thanks for taking the time to do so. Let's take a moment here to share my screen. Great. So it's a great privilege of mine to share with you just a commentary here that I have on Fratelli Tutti, and really trying to emphasize the Latino social dimensions of this encyclical on the topic of globalization from the people. Fratelli Tutti has, as you know, was released during the pandemic, perhaps has only received fair consideration or treatment given our global situation. It certainly didn't have any of the kind of rollout or anticipation that you saw in something like Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. I don't want to lose sight of what could be here, some really important contributions of this document. So that's really what I'm trying to do here by looking at the kind of Latino style of social teaching that we see in this document, because that's something that doesn't really come out in a good part, most of the commentary, at least in North America and in Europe, on this encyclical. And one of the reasons I want to do that is really to allay some of the criticisms that, or respond to some of the criticisms that Pope Francis's thought, in particular his social thought, might be prone to vagueness or oversimplification or a lack of clarity. This is something that he's tends to be criticized for by skeptics, or that he appears to be changing tradition. So what I really want to do with this presentation here is by looking at the kind of the Hispanic theological background of this document and pointing to where those Latino social dimensions kind of come out in the document. I really want to bring out the greater kind of substance and depth, I think, that actually marks Pope Francis's thought from the beginning of his pontificate, although again, that doesn't seem to get enough attention sometimes. So the first thing to say is that this document comes after really the triumvirate of documents that deal with the three themes that he laid out at the beginning of his papacy, the three social concerns of Pope Francis that speak to his namesake and wanting to choose Saint Francis. And the first one, of course, was the topic of poverty that was addressed specifically in Evangelii Gaudium, or the joy of the gospel, this very important apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis that really identifies the social dimensions of evangelization, very much in the spirit of previous documents of the church. Evangelii Nuntiandi of Paul VI, especially, is one that I have in mind here as kind of carrying on this tradition of thinking about the social dimensions of evangelization, and the church existing as mission, and social mission being a key component of that mission. He also talks in that document, I won't go into detail more here, but just to say that the option for the poor is a theological category. And that's, of course, something that I think speaks to the Hispanic theological background from which he comes. The other theme that, or concern that comes up, of course, in Pope Francis's thought that was really highlighted, of course, was that of the planet, or the earth, the environment, which of course is the focus of Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And I mean, really not much more needs to be said about that, since there's been a great deal of commentary on Laudato Si. But I'll return back to the document here in just a moment as a way of kind of helping to frame the trajectory of social teaching during the Francis papacy. The last, of course, the most recent, the one that's the subject of our conversation, or my presentation today and our conversation later, is, of course, Fratelli Tutti, which deals with the theme of peace, which, of course, again, speaks to his namesake, Saint Francis, who opens up in the beginning part of the encyclical, and reflecting on his visit and interaction with the Sultan in Islam. And so there, what we see in Fratelli Tutti is a reference to peace, not only at the local level, but more, kind of substantively at the global level, right? Of the human family being the kind of central theme throughout this document, and the role particularly that faith and religion plays in securing that peace, or promoting that peace, which is not merely the absence of war, but actually an active engagement and dialogue and friendship with different peoples. And of course, he ends that document, Fratelli Tutti, with a reflection on the kind of interreligious peace building and friendship that he has with the Grand Imam, and also so that you see this again, this kind of reference to interreligious peace building. One of the things that kind of runs through these documents that I want to draw attention to and focusing on the theme of globalization is how the globalization of indifference runs through these documents as a sign of the times. You hear that language of economy of exclusion, this kind of approach to globalization that ends up dividing society and forgetting people on the margins of society, especially with respect to those who are part of not just the formal economy, but the informal economy especially, which is given attention in this document. But Francis isn't just negative in thinking about the sign of the times. I mean, and that's something that I really want to draw attention to here in looking at his Latino social context and background, is the attention he gives to a more positive sign of globalization that also comes out in this document. The globalization of indifference, of course, was already an important theme going back to the beginning of his pontificate when he went outside of Rome for the first time to visit the migrants of Lampedusa, where he first mentioned that theme. So I just gave you kind of a microcosm of Francis's thought on and social thought. But now what I want to do is kind of step back and look at kind of where he fits in the trajectory of Catholic social teaching for the 21st century, to see kind of some patterns and themes that are coming forth in the Church's social teaching in the years to come. And one of the themes that really comes out, as we've seen in the 21st century social documents, of which there are 3, are the crises of globalization. So that's really why I want to draw attention to globalization here in this presentation, is because of the previous documents, going back to Benedict XVI and Caritas and Veritate, have been giving attention to these crises. As you probably know, Caritas and Veritate, which came out in 2009, was coming out of this response to the global financial crisis. And in that context, he really gives attention to what he calls the economy of communion, or the logic of the gift, that he wants to see civil society really providing this kind of ameliorating and humanizing aspect to the wider economy and even politics. And so that's where that language of communion is important. And it's something that really does run through Francis's pontificate as well, although it sometimes doesn't get enough attention. The other document, of course, that we've already referenced was Laudato Si, which really kind of considers the ecological crisis of globalization under what Francis calls the technocratic paradigm. That document, of course, doesn't just focus on that kind of apocalyptic dimension, but rather also provides through the kind of standards see, judge, act model of Catholic social teaching. It provides kind of really parameters for social action through this concept of integral ecology. That's really an expansion and extension of the Church's language of integral development, or the development of peoples, that goes back to Pope Paul VI, a theme that I'll also return back to. And then lastly, Fratelli Tutti, I think one way of thinking about the significance of this document following the different crises of globalization is that it's in the context of the pandemic and ethnic and racial conflicts that we're seeing with the rise of populism around the world, is really the political crisis of globalization. And that's really kind of the theme here that's going to come out in the talk today. But again, not just having a sort of negative vision here, Francis talks about the unity of the human family, a kind of unity and diversity, and the social friendship and the popular solidarity that can be promoted in the face of that kind of political crisis posed by a kind of singular model of globalization, or a homogeneous model of globalization that we'll talk about here momentarily. So what are some themes then in looking at the Latino social teaching, if you will, of Pope Francis? So the first thing I want to point out here is just the importance of the global South and Hispanic demographics and the significance of this document, and how it really should inform the way we read this document. You know, there's no doubt that the church, Latin America has really emerged in the latter half of the 20th century and now in the 21st century as a kind of source church. And that's a term that's been used by different theologians. But what it's recognizing, at least on a demographic level, is just the fact that Latin America and or South America rather, is the most populous Catholic continent in the world, and 40% of Catholics worldwide reside in Latin America. And so that has displaced Europe as being the kind of center and the hub of Catholicism. And so it's really telling that we have our first Pope coming from the global South and from Latin America in the 21st century to reflect those kinds of shifts. But also the global South constitutes more than 2/3 of the universal church. So I think we should anticipate greater attention to the themes that come out in Francis's pontificate for the future of Catholic social teaching, especially if we begin to have more popes from the global South. That's just something I think to keep in mind. The other key component here that I want to draw attention to in this talk is the role that a theology of the people, or la teología del pueblo, has for Pope Francis, and really kind of the center, the focus that he gives to the concept of the people in this document, I think is going to be a lasting legacy of this document if it's taken seriously. And one of the things that I think really comes out of this document, and again, it's a reflection on this theology of the people that has really kind of Argentine roots that I'll talk about more here shortly, is that it really gives, I think, a more robust and substantive account of what Pope John Paul II referred to in previous social encyclicals as the subjectivity of society. And this is, I think, a really important theme for thinking about the future of democracies, where the kinds of conflicts we're facing today within democratic societies, not just with the rise of populism, but just all kinds of issues pertaining to wealth inequality and globalization, that the subjectivity of society and the participation of people within society and having that sense of being a people or becoming a people is really an important theme that's not going to go away anytime soon. And so just another way of emphasizing the importance of the Hispanic kind of theological background of Pope Francis is, the different contributions that the Latin American church has made on social thought in the last 50, 60 years, particularly with the language of the preferential option for the poor, which first emerged in the context of Latin American bishops' meetings at Puebla in 1979, and so in the Medellin before that in the 1960s, 1968. That language of turning to the poor found its way to the universal or global church through the papacy of John Paul II, as well as the theme of structural sin, or the structures of sin. So again, here are kind of theological categories that have made their mark on the global church that first emerged out of this kind of regional context of Latin America. And I think we're going to find something, or I hope we'll maybe see something similar with Francis's notion of the people, leaving a kind of mark on the universal church and the future of social social teaching. The last point I want to make about the contribution of Fratelli Tutti is its attention to this term that's often used, but sometimes vaguely deployed or not clearly deployed, the term of neoliberalism. Whenever you have an ism in Catholic social teaching, you know, it's always a sign that this is something important, going back to the use of you know, isms with respect to socialism, collectivism, individualism, liberalism, right? These various isms are ways that the church has drawn attention to ideologies that are deeply influential in shaping social, political, and economic life for peoples. And so the term neoliberalism is unsurprisingly invoked here kind of after the fact. That is, you know, this is a term and an object of study in the social sciences, and historians now are really giving more attention to this topic. You know, it's been out for some time, but like many of the church's social teachings, it comes a bit late. But nevertheless, it's there now, and it's part of the documentary heritage and tradition. And so it's something that I think deserves attention, at least with respect to how it emerged in Francis's own Hispanic background in Latin America. And also, of course, the kind of flip side of neoliberalism is this theme of globalization from the people, which we'll be coming back to. All right, so the theme that we find in this document, as elsewhere, especially in Evangelii Gaudium, or the joy of the gospel, is this theme that Francis wants to really make a centerpiece of his papacy, and that's on becoming a people, right? Which is a theme, obviously, that's very important for us today in this very divisive political culture that we live in. What does it mean to be a people? The first thing to say is that this notion of becoming a people was already an important aspect of Francis's episcopal ministry when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. That is the theme of el pueblo, that is the people. That this was important to him as a way of kind of mobilizing national identity, but not in a way that's prone to division or scapegoating or nativism or racism, for that matter, but rather, again, a kind of unity and diversity. The term pueblo can have this kind of mobilizing force for restoring a sense of being home among people with a shared identity. And when he was Bishop of Buenos Aires, or Archbishop, he released a document called La Nación para Construir in 2005, where he actually gives el pueblo kind of central consideration in that, as a way of helping to kind of rejuvenate an Argentine sense of peoplehood. And there it's interesting, especially given some of the topics that are forthcoming for the Lumen Christi Institute, that he draws on St. Augustine's account of how we think about a people that comes from the city of God. And that's something I think worth just giving attention to, that a people is a common fellowship of rational beings united by their common objects of love. So this is a theme that he wants to use, or an idea he wants to use, is kind of getting at what it means to be a people. Another theme that comes out in thinking about the process of, again, it's a process of becoming a people. We're not just a people to begin with. It's something that's actually constructed in Francis's his approach, and I think that's worth considering. That, but in doing that, he also gives attention to the language of the people of God that comes out of the Second Vatican Council, and that the people of God incarnate in peoples of the earth, right? And so that theme of enculturation, of the gospel being enculturated in different peoples, is again what adds to the richness and the diversity of the church, even as it's unified and global and universal sense. A facet of being a people is peoples are kind of agents of history, and or subjects of history, and that's something that will also come out more as we talk about this theme of peoplehood, and also the joy of the gospel, the attention that it gives to constructing or becoming a people according to these 4 pillars that Pope Francis mentions, and I'll just quickly recite them here. But that time is greater than space, unity prevails over conflict, realities are greater than ideas, and the whole is greater than the parts. These are all pillars he sees as being integrally connected to the Church's social teachings, and are crucial for how it is that we can become a people in our particular context. Another theme here of being a people is the role that piety plays, and popular piety as a kind of locus of theological reflection. And then this is, I think, just reflective of his Hispanic theological context, and something that's been very important in US Latino or Latinx theology, the role of popular piety. But that becoming a people too also entails this culture of encounter, where we're encountering others and yet finding common ground and shared aspects of identity despite our differences. And lastly, the role that work and employment plays in this construction of peoplehood. This is a theme, again, I'll return back to later in the presentation, but something that is, again, kind of integral to what it means to be a people is the dignity of labor is crucial in that endeavor. So the people versus populism. This is a contested aspect of Pope Francis. Is he a populist? Given his Hispanic or Argentine background and the leadership of President Juan Perón in his Argentine background. And I think here it's important to focus on the distinction he wants to make between the people and populism. And one of the points he makes in his writings is to say that populism, and in particular his recent book, Let Us Dream, which has a number of reflections that really overlap nicely with themes in Fratelli Tutti. Populism is reacting to a form of globalization that has gone wrong. So it's protesting something that Francis thinks is real. So it speaks to something in populism that can be kind of alluring and attractive. And yet it goes wrong by its divisiveness or its presumption to speak on behalf of all people, and through a kind of demagoguery or whatever resources or means it uses to scapegoat and to create division in society rather than unity. Now, to say more about that Argentine social context of Pope Francis, it is important to recognize just how much the legacy of Perón and Peronism plays in his thought and the thought of the theology of the people that emerges from Argentina in the second half of the 20th century. Perón really kind of emerged as a figure who was against oligarchy and elitism, and kind of trying to find this third way between communism and liberalism by focusing on workers. But we should recognize that Francis himself never came to politically endorse the party, nor did he obviously ever adopt a kind of messianic view of Perón that was characteristic of a number of his followers. So I think it's important to see here the figure instead of Martín Fierro, who is this kind of 19th century iconic figure that was memorialized in the writings of Jose Hernandez, that really is a figure of the gaucho, which is a kind of mestizo-like character who really embodies this kind of unity and diversity of the Argentine people, where you see this kind of mixing of cultures and ethnicities and roles, a kind of interculturality. This, I think, more in Francis's thought is it kind of holds the substance of what it means to be a people, a story like this, because the people for Francis is he wants to say a kind of mythical and historical category. And mythical not meaning, you know, made up, but rather kind of rooted in stories and in art. It has the ability to kind of captivate the imagination and think outside kind of the categories of you know, kind of standard conventional categories. The other important kind of contribution to Francis's understanding of the people, or pueblo, was the San Miguel Declaration, which came out of the Argentine Bishops' Conference in the 1960s, after the Second Vatican Council, after the meeting of Latin American bishops in Medellin. The San Miguel Declaration was very important because it emphasized the pastoral aim of becoming a people of God in the midst of poor people. And so this San Miguel Declaration is really kind of a blueprint for the theology of the people that ends up developing later in Argentina, or Rio de la Plata school of thought, you might say. That really draws attention to ordinary working peoples as the subjects of their own history. Another aspect here is just Francis's own episcopal you know, experience, right? And his working particularly with communities of clergy that were working among the poor in slums. And so Francis, as part of his ministry, would go out and celebrate Mass on these kind of in these marginalized communities that were really developing in the 1980s and 90s, to draw attention to the popular piety that exists, especially among the poor. And you know, it's interesting that during Francis's own life, he was a very strong proponent and supporter of the movement of excluded workers in Argentina and in Buenos Aires, befriending one of their chief kind of social organizers and legal advocates during his episcopacy. And Francis himself even spent time, he talks about this, records this in his book, Let Us Dream, his time that he spent with cartoneros, or those who would go around at night kind of in garbage heaps, collecting items to recycle and selling those items just to make ends meet. Again, members of that kind of informal economy, or the excluded members of the economy that Francis himself had direct experience with in encountering the people of faith on these margins. And lastly, just I want to give brief attention here to something that some commentators of Francis have already done. It's just the political legacy of the Spanish Jesuit Francisco Suarez, who is someone who has a political kind of story and legacy in Argentina, where his thought was actually important in influencing the 1810 May Revolution, of kind of setting the foundations for Argentine independence. And this is something that I think comes out in Francis's documents, particularly in Fratelli Tutti, where he talks about the right of peoples, a term that has kind of fallen out of favor in the last 50, 60 years in Catholic social teaching, which is the law of nations. Francis seems to still want to give attention to that concept, or at least kind of resuscitate it in a new global context that we're in, as well as the language of natural rights. And this, of course, comes up in a very interesting way when the document makes the distinction between primary natural right and secondary natural right, and primary natural right being a principle that recognizes the universal destination of goods, or the right of common use among all peoples, the way the scholastic heritage would put it, that Francisco Suarez belonged to, in contrast to, say, private property, which Francis refers to as a secondary natural right. Francis isn't making this up. I mean, this is something that goes back to the Spanish scholastics, Suarez in particular, but even earlier in the medieval scholastic and canon legal tradition. So that's something I think also that begs or deserves attention. Now turning to this theme of neoliberalism. Again, this is a term that's nowhere else in other encyclicals, at least in any explicit way, but I think we find already in previous social teaching attention to this concept in different ways, even though the term may not be used the way as explicitly as Francis uses it. And here I just want to draw attention to Pope Paul VI's 80th year commemoration of Rerum Novarum, which is seen as the first of the social encyclicals of the modern tradition, Octogesima Adveniens, where Paul VI spoke about that under the driving force of new systems of production, national frontiers are breaking down and we can see new economic powers emerging, the multinational enterprises, which by the concentration and flexibility of their means can conduct autonomous strategies which are largely independent of the national political powers and therefore not subject to control from the point of view of the common good. By extending their activities, these private organizations can lead to a new and abusive form of economic domination on the social, cultural, and even political level. The excessive concentration on the means and powers that Pope Pius XI already condemned on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum is taking on a new and very real image. Right, so this is in 1971, where we're already kind of, obviously the Cold War is very much, in effect here, and you've gotten a great deal of attention in the social writings on the kind of conflict between liberal individualism and collectivist socialism or communism. But there's another theme as well that often can get kind of lost sight of in that bipolar interpretation of the church's social teachings. And that's the language that Pius XI and Paul VI, or that the term that they use of the international imperialism of money, which he's giving an account of here in this passage from Octogesima Adveniens. This is the age of multinationals and transnational corporations, right? And really a kind of weakening of the sovereign state. I mean, one thing that often gets lost sight of is probably the greatest defender of the sovereignty of the state in the 20th century has actually been the papacy, the institution that's given the kind of greatest credence to the sovereignty of the state, which may seem kind of unconventional a way of thinking, given that human rights is often seen as emerging in the aftermath of totalitarianism and the violence of particular states, nation states against their citizens. But nevertheless, in the kind of global context and the larger vision of Catholic social thought, one of the great dangers that the popes continually give attention to, and one of the reasons they use this language of social justice, is to really to not allow the economy to dictate the terms of politics, right? Which is something that really tends to happen in this kind of neoliberal context of globalization that that the popes have been giving attention to in the 20th century already. And one of the kind of key features of what you might call a kind of neoliberal outlook in this period of the 20th century is the desire and the kind of the role of technical experts and economists and even political thinkers in wanting to protect and encase the world economy, and in particular private capital and the right of free trade, to protect that from what is often seen as the threat to that freedom of trade and the expansion of private capital across national borders, from regionalism and from democratic social movements. There's been increasing historiography on this, as well as social scientific work to kind of chart this development in what one author calls the kind of Geneva School. Friedrich Hayek and other figures are kind of associated with developing the kind of the roots of a sort of neoliberal outlook. And it doesn't mean the kind of evisceration of the state, but rather seeing the state as being subservient and protective of a certain understanding of the world economy that's advantageous to the global north, typically how it plays out sociologically. But Francis's understanding of neoliberalism is undoubtedly shaped by the reflection on this transformation in Latin America. And so, one of the key documents I think that's worth giving attention to here is the one put out by the Latin American Jesuits on the topic of neoliberalism in Latin America. And of course, Francis being a Jesuit, he would have been very well aware of this document in his own social thinking. And this document was really just trying to give attention to the transformations, really kind of major transformations that were occurring across Latin America in the 80s and the 90s in particular, and just trying to provide some kind of social analysis with respect to these economic transformations, kind of one of which was the result of the emergence, as you see in this very telling image here of a Brazilian city, of the emergence of the favelas, or the slums, right, during this period, especially of the 80s and 90s, to really kind of show the wealth disparity that's so pronounced in Latin American societies that are inseparable from the economic and political transformations that were taking place. The other, I think, documents that are important to consider for shaping Francis's thought on globalization and in particular neoliberal globalization were the two Ceylon documents, one being on the kind of ethics of globalization, which looks at both kind of the positive account of globalization, or globalization from below, as it's called in that document, in contrast to this more kind of homogeneous, asymmetrical expression of globalization that doesn't respect the autonomy of cultures and peoples the way, or subsidiarity for that matter, the way it's emphasized in Catholic social thought under a more kind of neoliberal model. And the other document, of course, is one that Francis had a direct involvement in. It's the overseer of the drafting of the document, was the meeting at Aparecida of the Latin American bishops, where that document as well talks about the kind of the weakening of the state in Latin America, and how this kind of global economy of exclusion has manifest itself in the context of Latin American countries. And of course, as you may have heard, it's this document too, where or in the context of drafting that document in Aparecida, that Francis really begins to give attention in his own ministry to the question of ecology, given the importance of the Amazon in Latin America, and the struggle of indigenous peoples in particular. I mean, I find it interesting that Francis's recent comments on his own kind of ecological conversion, as he puts it, happened in the context of drafting that document, where he initially went into that meeting of Aparecida being like, well, what's the big deal? You all are talking about the Amazon all the time. I mean, he's very, as he often is, very kind of blunt and forthright about his views, and how over the course of the drafting of that document and the exchange, he came to realize just how important this was as an aspect of the church's mission. And you see that, of course, reflected in the apostolic exhortation on Querida Amazonia, the beloved Amazon. And lastly, I mean, kind of one of the ways that the neoliberal globalization, and this has been a subject of social scientific analysis, has kind of bore out to the disadvantage of the poor, has been kind of reflection on the structural adjustment programs that were instituted as a means of addressing the monumental and relieving the monumental debt crisis that was afflicting Latin America in particular, and also many third world countries during the 1980s, and the role that the you know, the IMF and the World Bank played in kind of carrying out those adjustment programs that were designed under kind of this austerity and in an effort to promote kind of national growth in Latin American countries, but according to economic indicators. So when Francis uses that language of trickle down, that has kind of rubbed some people, economists and certain people, the wrong way. That's the context, I think, to understand that, how those policies kind of played out, ones that deregulated the activities of multinationals and transnational corporations, that raised interest rates, cut government spending, and increased the production of exports. That kind of model that was imposed on Latin American countries asymmetrically as a way of relieving debt, according to the measures that were being imposed, did not work out to the advantage of the poor. So what can be sort of seen then as the alternative here that Francis presents? And this is really kind of the last part of the presentation that I want to draw attention to. Francis, I see Francis is really kind of picking up on this, something that's been happening in the Latin American church since the post-conciliar meetings of Celam, the Latin American bishops of Medellin and Puebla, especially, which is really a kind of alternative view of human rights that goes back to the option for the poor, and what Medellin calls the rights of the poor in particular, that this speaks to, again, that kind of that ecclesial context that gave rise to liberation theologies, and this teología del pueblo that you find Francis being more kind of rooted in. And so, you know, one of the interesting aspects here, I think, of this kind of alternative view of human rights that Francis will talk about in Fratelli Tutti, he says, all this calls for an alternative way of thinking. Without an attempt to enter into that way of thinking, what I'm saying here will sound wildly unrealistic. We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. So what is this alternative way of thinking? And I think one way of characterizing it is it's a way of thinking from the global south, to kind of put it, you know, very kind of crudely and simply. It's just a different way of thinking about what matters in the life of a people, and what you know can be sort of getting attention in terms of the church's social analysis of the problems that afflict society. And one of the ways I think that's interesting, in which Francis draws attention to this alternative perspective, and again, this is something I think you find characteristic of Latin American theologians already in the 70s and 80s, who are very critical of ideas of human rights from the global north, like someone like Jimmy Carter, who made, you know, human rights kind of a central theme of his foreign policy, for example. And that was a number of Latin American social theorists and theologians were very cautious about that language, and actually very critical of it, because it was seen as being tied to an economic and political agenda. And so I find it interesting that in Francis's thought, in his discussion of neoliberalism, he's also talking about insufficiently universal human rights. And then there's been some history done on this in the past, you know, decade or so, charting kind of the curious, peculiar emergence of both neoliberalism as a kind of economic political ideology, and its reforms, as well as the language of universal human rights as a matter of foreign policy, and the rise of human rights organizations or non-governmental organizations. That there's a curious coincidence of the rise of these two things, and what is the relationship between the two? I think Francis gives us a way of thinking about that when he says in Evangelii Gaudium, right? Sadly, even human rights can be used as an inordinate defense of individual rights or the rights of richer peoples. Whose rights are being defended here in this talk about human rights? That's something that is really crucial to Francis's deployment of that language. critical deployment of that language of human rights. It's oftentimes taken for granted as a kind of lingua franca of universal justice or global justice. And one of the ways of getting at that kind of alternative point of view is the rights of the poor, the rights of migrants and indigenous peoples that gets more attention in his ministry and in his writings. As I mentioned before, the rights of the poor kind of emerged in the context of the Latin American church as a way of challenging views of human rights that oftentimes get sort of reduced to civil and political rights, right? The right to free speech. I mean, these are obviously important things, but that shouldn't be kind of dictating how we think about human rights, because for Francis, one of what ends up happening in that kind of attention to civil political rights is and I think a number of other Latin American theologians is rights become kind of determined by the language of private property. So they become more individualistic or individualized. And that loses that sense of the social nature of the human person, but also socioeconomic rights, cultural rights, and environmental rights that the church is drawing more attention to now. And I think the way that he does this is through his kind of sacred trifecta of rights, which interestingly enough, private property is not there. And again, this has drawn some response from Francis's supporters and critics alike, right? So he gives attention to what he calls the las tres T, or the three L's of labor, lodging, and land in English, or trabajo, techo, and tierra. This is a key theme, or attention to these rights in particular, which Francis thinks are actually are prerequisites for having a true democracy. He'll say that in the context of his meetings with popular movements. And that's where I really want to kind of end this presentation today, is the importance of the world meetings of popular movements that have characterized Francis's papacy, and I think will have an important legacy for the future of the church in the 20th century. And it's here in the context of these meetings, these transnational meetings that draw together organizations, both people of faith and no faith at all, coming into these settings to talk about their kind of shared plight and solidarity in the attempt to craft really a kind of globalization from below, or what you might call a kind of subsidiarity activism that creatively resists what Francis calls in these letters to the popular movements, the idolatry of money, which is a term he also uses in Evangelii Gaudium, or Dios dinero, the money god. So this is the kind of empire of mammon that Francis gives a lot of attention to, that is manifest in this kind of globalization of indifference, or an economy of exclusion. Really wanting to give attention to the voices of the people who struggle in the face of that. Again, members of both the formal and the informal economy. Francis has hosted these meetings at the Vatican, but also elsewhere. He also hosted a meeting in Bolivia with indigenous peoples. And one thing I find really interesting here, drawing this presentation to a close, is the kind of providential and Christological importance that the organized poor have for Francis. And I think, again, this speaks to the kind of the Latin American theological context that shapes his thought, where he writes in the Third World Meeting of Popular Movements, his letter, he says, sometimes I think that when you, the organized poor, create your own work, establishing a cooperative, restoring a ruined factory, recycling the refuse of the consumer society, braving the elements in order to sell your wares in a public square, reclaiming a parcel of farmland to feed the hungry, whenever you do these things, you are imitating Jesus, because you are trying to heal, even if minimally and provisionally, that atrophy of the dominant socioeconomic system, which is unemployment. I am not surprised that at times you find yourselves being watched or persecuted, nor am I surprised that the proud have no interest in what you are saying. So there in that passage, Francis precedes that reflection there by talking about Jesus's healing of the man with the withered hand in the Gospels on the Sabbath, and how in doing that he's healing the worker of his hands, and the ability, giving him kind of the ability to work once again, and the dignity of work, and that drew a great criticism and ire from the Pharisees. And so that image of these organized communities of workers, these movements as reflecting kind of the life of Jesus, is something that I think is very interesting and intriguing about Francis's thought. And I would just say too that this attention to popular movements, again, to speak to the Latin American context, it's the attention to these movements happens, in the 2000s. There's a great attention to what's known as the World Social Forum, which is a collective gathering of different social movements meeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil in 2001. That's meant to be a kind of a model, an alternative model of globalization that resists neoliberalism via kind of transnational counter public of movements that are in solidarity with one another. So again, that World Social Forum is another, I think, important kind of Latin American context in which Francis is framing his attention to these popular movements. And lastly, just to conclude, the possibility of becoming a people, I think, really relies on something that Francis has given attention to following the encyclical of Benedict XVI on charity and truth, which is this desire to establish a kind of new social compact or a cultural covenant for the sake of securing and promoting peace. And that this is something I think that's, again, very kind of intriguing in Francis's thought as a kind of alternative to what we might see with the sort of standard liberal social contract model of individuals coming together to form a society, but rather a people being formed willingly and voluntarily in solidarity with one another. So with that, there was a lot here, and I appreciate your patience in getting through this material. And there's a lot here that I didn't get to in terms of details, but perhaps we can talk more about that during the Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm astounded. There's so many different moving parts that you addressed very deftly and in an integrated fashion: ongoing process of economic globalization, Celam roots, Argentine roots, Buenos Aires roots, and then also the relationship to Latino ideas about peoplehood. And you even brought in the Imitatio Christi. So congratulations, thank you very much. There's some really interesting questions in the chat. I'd like to get right to it. Since it was a question of clarification, let's start by recognizing Molly Greening.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I had a clarifying question here because you mentioned something about the law of nations and how it's fallen out of favor in the past. I think you said 50 or 60 years. And I was just wondering, could you say some more about this? Why did this term fall out of favor, and how is Pope Francis's use of these primary and secondary natural rights responding to that, resuscitating it in a different way?
That's a great question. Yeah. So what I meant by it falling out of favor, I specifically meant that in the context of the church's social teachings, not generally with respect to international law, because international law has its own kind of history of using that terminology that follows a little bit of a different trajectory. But I'll get to both of those. I mean, one point to say is that I think it really kind of falls out of favor because it no longer has the hold it once did in the international realm. The law of nations was, I think, always historically a very important concept in the church's teachings or kind of social and political tradition, because it was able to recognize kind of the rationality of peoples across very different cultures that could have similar kinds of practices that aren't necessarily derived directly from what you might call the natural law, but still speak to kind of different societies' own way of adjudicating what would be beneficial for that society. And so everything from slavery to private property usually fell under that categorization of the law of nations. I think one of the reasons it really fell out of favor in Catholic social thought was historically the law of nations, again, was the space in which the church, or at least Catholic thought, could locate something like private property. And with Leo XIII, you get a very different kind of development in the tradition to emphasize more the kind of the natural basis of private property, to the point of seeing it rather as a kind of natural right. And so with that, and slavery, obviously, and the abolition of slavery, there's no need to talk about that as being part of the law of nations anymore. I think it loses its character, or its importance with the church, given the development of the church's social thought, I think in large part with respect to private property and also slavery, but also because it just sort of falls out of favor in the international legal realm for various reasons. There's a kind of positivism that really takes over in late 19th century international law that doesn't kind of hold on to that understanding of the law of nations as this in-between of civil positive law and natural law. So there's a larger story to tell there. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, because when Francisco Suarez mentions private property, for example, or when he talks about secondary natural rights and private property falling under that, he also talks about that as being a concessive law of nations as well. So he's kind of using the secondary natural rights as another way of talking about the law of nations. This is very technical, but that's, I think, that's just to give more context. That's a great question.
Thank you, Molly, for that question. So there's a series of questions about translating this social vision that comes from Latin America into the US context. And I'm going to try to summarize 2 or 3 of them and see if you might want to address some aspect of that. So an anonymous attendee asks, how does this Latino Catholic social thought affect evangelization, specifically to Latinos in the United States? And Luis Carlos Ayala, in a similar vein, talks about how neoliberalism is sometimes seen as the antithesis of communism and socialism, and asks, do you think that the embrace of neoliberalism in the US is a product of poor catechism and lack of understanding the gospel due to the national church, in parentheses, North versus South? Let me just stop there and see if you want to say something about the challenge of translating this Latin American vision into US and Latino context.
Yeah, no, those are both great questions that are challenging questions, given the attempt to try to apply this to a North American or US context. The question of Latino social thought and evangelization, I think one of the benefits of kind of turning to this past and this heritage of a prominent figure like Pope Francis is, I think it gets at a kind of greater depth of the Latino theological tradition, which oftentimes to the outside church, or I should say the kind of more Anglo church in North America, will often see Hispanic communities or this Hispanic church as, oh yeah, there's popular piety, but there's not really a kind of a deeper story or a deeper narrative or tradition. And so that's where I think of the work of like Archbishop Gomez, who's I think done really important work on trying to at least making an attempt to try to recover that Latino heritage just here in the United States, because that's something that the Catholic Church needs to be far more proactive about in talking about the Hispanic history of the United States, rather than just the kind of Anglo-Protestant or maybe Catholic Maryland, whatever it might be, and talking about the history of the founding of our nation. So I think the language that's used in the kind of Rio de la Plata school that I referred to, the theology of the People's School in Argentina that Francis belongs to, is this notion of la patria grande, the kind of large identity of Latinos or Hispanics, right? That connects the North and the South. And I think one of the ways that that's happening in this kind of evangelical moment now is part of the work that Peter's been directly involved in, and so many others that I've been very privileged to be a part of, is the interaction between Hispanics in North America and Latin America, and that dialogue as being kind of a shared, having a shared identity, as referring to this kind of patria grande. And I think there we can find, at least among theologians, we can find more resources. But yeah, I think not to denigrate popular piety in the least, I think that's a rich and an ongoing resource for evangelization in Hispanic communities, or in drawing in people of faith to those communities. The question of neoliberalism in the U.S. context, yeah, that, I mean, it's hard to locate that now politically. I think that's actually a big challenge, and part of the reason why I want to draw attention to this theme in Francis's thought is because our politics tends to play out very differently. And when we read Francis or his writings in the U.S. context, we tend to do it through this polarized filter that we have of our left versus right. And you know, there's some truth to those categories, of course, transnationally, but I think neoliberalism can sort of speak to different facets of our political life as a country that sort of are beyond the sort of left-right typology, and perhaps even include both of those political outlooks. And I think the church, in its task, it has to be continually drawing attention to the dangers of the idolatry of money. And I think that goes back to the very beginning of the church's ministry and the Gospels. And so that I think is something that deserves a great deal of attention in the evangelical life of the church. Oftentimes that gets kind of overburdened by these political debates and controversies. So I didn't get to that question, but it was a good.
That's great. You talked about popular movements, and there's at least two questions about activist groups and how they might be included. Maybe we could recognize John Barnacastle, so he can ask his question.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, John.
Sorry, I'm cooking right now while I'm also watching this on the West Coast. But
thanks for joining.
So my question is kind of related to what you were just talking about. Given the partisanship at the federal level, and in an effort to build on the shared history and shared culture, particularly around the borderlands, what spaces are there for subnational entities or activist groups to build a more cohesive transnational unity between, I'm thinking kind of particularly California and say Baja California, where there might be both political will and a shared culture and history on which to build a more inclusive economic arrangement that pushes back against the neoliberal order.
Yeah, no, that's I mean that's a very particular question, but just kind of the spaces you're talking about. I mean, that's really why I wanted to draw attention to these world meetings of popular movements. One of which, you know, the regional meeting was held in Modesto, California, several years ago. I don't know if you were familiar with that, but you can already see that kind of taking place on a regional level. The appropriation of that message of Francis. And I think one thing to keep in mind here in terms of this pursuit, as you're talking about, in building these kinds of coalitions that can sometimes bring together very unlikely allies, is that from the perspective of Francis, and this really deserves mentioning here, it's not a paternalistic kind of relationship here to these movements. So there really is that kind of grassroots mentality of being from the people. And I think his experience of being an archbishop in Buenos Aires and really kind of accompanying the cartoneros in their plight within BA, is a model of that kind of accompaniment that he wants the church to participate in. And certainly I think kind of there are already transnational actors with respect to the church and the different religious orders that you see, for example, with the Jesuits in the context of Latin America and their response to neoliberalism. But there are all kinds of ways for this to kind of play out among both religious and lay communities that kind of, again, from a theological standpoint, see themselves or an ecclesiological standpoint, see themselves as accompanying and learning from these communities through dialogue rather than kind of coming in to impose some ideal. But I know that doesn't get to your question sufficiently, but thank you.
There's a lot of questions here, and I'm afraid I won't be able to get to all of them, but a good concluding question was posed by Judy Holmes. Is she still there? We can ask her to raise that. Go ahead, Judy.
Presentation was excellent. Thanks so much. My thought is, if you had the chance to meet and speak with Pope Francis, what would you ask him, or what would you say to him for all his work in these areas?
Wow. Such a presumptuous thing, right? To think of what I would ask him. I actually never thought of that. Yeah, I mean, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess I have one just kind of self-serving answer that has to do with my research on the topic, but I won't go there. I think just with respect to this topic and this presentation, yeah, I mean, I guess I would want to know where he thinks the church is heading in the 21st century. I mean, obviously, we've already seen kind of his reflection on these various crises that are taking place. But if he were to go out even farther, what would he see as being the possibilities and the limits of the church's kind of advocacy for these social issues in the future, and particularly with respect to the digital age? I think that to me is an area. We're talking about automation and all these other kinds of developments in technology. The church, as I pointed out, is always behind the curve when it comes to identifying and analyzing social issues. And that's just the way it is as an institutional body. But then it has the ability to kind of preserve that through this documentary tradition. But I'd want to know what he thinks about that world that's to come, the kind of the digital kind of world, and how we deal with increasing, I think, and growing wealth inequality in that context. I don't know, it's a great question. You've planted a seed, Judy, so I appreciate it. So maybe if that day ever comes, just thank you for getting me to think about that.
Yeah, we've recorded this, so we'll send it to the Vatican, and you can expect a tweet on this issue tomorrow afternoon. No, I just want to thank you again, David. What an amazing presentation. You provoked a really great discussion. And among other things, you showed us the relationship to the broader Catholic social tradition and prepared the way for Miguel Romero's discussion about St. Thomas and disability for next week. So it's a great segue to what's coming afterwards as well. But I'd ask everyone, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and especially for those whose questions I was not able to pose. I apologize, but I want to thank everyone for being here and ask you to join me in congratulating and thanking David for this beautiful presentation.
Thank you so much.
So I'll pass it over to Michael for.
Well, once more, thank you, David, and thank you, Peter, for a fantastic conversation. David, for really helping us dig into these Latino roots of Catholic social thought. And I think it's really a hallmark of our programming at Lumen Christi that we go beyond the principles of CST to really see how over time these documents have engaged with their historical context and formed a tradition a tradition that we can continue to engage with genealogically, picking apart these histories. So thank you very much. And Peter, thank you not only for a fantastic job moderating, but really for playing the role of architect for this whole series. And thank you all for joining us. You can register today for the next installment of our series with Miguel Romero on a Latino theology of disability at our website or in the links that were posted in the chat. You can join our mailing list today to stay tuned for future programs on Hispanic theology. This series is made possible by a generous grant from the Our Sunday Visitor Institute. So thank you, Our Sunday Visitor. And it is co-sponsored by Actus, La Comunidad of Hispanic Scholars of Religion, Corazon Puro, the Collegium Institute, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, St. Benedict Institute, the Nova Forum, Calvert House Catholic Ministry, Dominican University Ministry Program, the Ecclesia in America Network, the Hank Center for Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Oscar Romero Scholars Program at Catholic Theological Union, ISCALI, Commonweal Magazine, and America Media. And I'd really invite you to go to our website and follow the links for many of these different institutions that are doing really fantastic work. But my gratitude goes out to them today for helping bring many of you into the room as viewers. Finally, I invite you to support us in two ways. One, help get word out to your friends and parishes, or follow us on social media and share our materials. And two, become a financial sponsor of our work by donating today at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. Otherwise, I hope you'll tune in again here next week, next Tuesday, and we look forward to welcoming you back. Bye-bye.